Hi, my name is Benedict for Higher Hertz. This is number 2 in our little arc on reverbs. The first one, we looked at really how reverb works and how to express that through the device that we looked at, which was one of the Dragonfly reverbs. OrilRiver is another freebie, and it is darn good. It's going to require a little bit of understanding, but remember, this series is not about how to get the freest, easiest reverb. It's about how to actually get to the point where you're beginning to master reverb. Because if you don't understand reverb, chances are you won't use it very well. And some of the greatest beauty in a mix is on how the space in which that performance appears to be happening is created. And it's not about presets or any of that kind of stuff that you see online and just infuriates me. It's about how you're going to sculpt that space so that when people listen to the illusion that is the piece of recorded music, whether you wrote it or are mixing it for somebody else, you have people feel like, oh, I'm really enjoying hearing this. And how you do that is by having a ever-deepening understanding of echo, which is delays, canyon, and its more fine-grained cousin, which is reverb, which is the that comes out afterwards. And it's everywhere in between, the very noticeable taps and the almost white noise kind of sound that you get with a later reverb. Fine unit, let's have a bit of a listen. Dry, mix, reverb in. So here there, as soon as, and this isn't a great example of reverb, and we're missing one of the key ingredients, which we will get to later as we apply this to a mix, you'll just notice that, and that comes in, suddenly these sounds go from seeming sort of separated from each other and stilted and papery and just not lovely, to feeling like, oh, suddenly they belong in a space and they belong more together. Reverb is part of that, and how you handle it and how you set it up is all part of how you control what people see and feel. OrilRiver has been around for some years. It is discontinued now. Normally, I'm not a big fan of covering discontinued things, but it's easy to get, and it is that good that it's worth using as long as it is available and functional. And it shows signs of being available and functional for some time to come, so there is no harm in, if nothing else, starting out and learning on this. Of the 3 reverbs that I'm presenting, in some ways, this is my favourite. I showed Dragonfly first because you have that little screen in the middle that helps get a sense of what's going on. Once you've got a sense of, well, what are these moving parts that make up reverb, then OrilRiver has a lot that's a little bit more conventional and easier to understand, because Dragonfly can be a little bit kooky. Doesn't mean that it doesn't sound good and that you can't use it and get great results, but the OrilRiver is better in a sense that it's just classier all round. Let's have a look at where it comes from, how you can get your sticky fingers on it. It's from Denis Tianov. Not quite sure how you pronounce that, seems reasonable. And now the only real safe place to get it is going to be through KVR. KVR Audio being the big central database of all things VST. There's not much VST that isn't available or discussed in some way on KVR. So if you look for OrilRiver, Google it, whatever, then my suggestion, go to the KVR place, because you'll get the last version. The download will be free and clean. Because it's so popular, there are places that will add extra malware, and you do not want those things. As it points out, this is the last version of it that it's suspended. In other words, it probably is a bit of a dead duck. You'll see the dark interface. I prefer the light interface because it's much easier to read. We'll go over that a little bit later. Let's look at its feature set. So we do have patches. So if we're running music, we can go through various patches. Now, I know a lot of you will think this is the right way to mix or a good enough way to mix. Okay, if you're just doing guide mixes and they're not for release, fair enough. But the moment you decide you are going to be the mix engineer, either for your job or for somebody else's, presets, they got to go. They're useful in a sense that you can sort of say, okay, well, that's roughly where I might want to set if I want a ridiculous sounding hall. But in reality, this is really not the right way to go about doing these things. So spend the time, learn how the program really works. If you are flipping through presets in a send and return situation, which we'll get into later, then you can lock the mixing functions. Really pretty important, otherwise you'll mess up every single time you move preset. Which moves us to mixing. Mixing on this is great. I don't think it could be any better. You've got the ability to change level of dry, early reflections, the late reflections, and the overall wet signal. But wait, there's more. You can actually turn off any of these, allowing you to focus in on whatever it is that you want to hear. So if you want to hear just how your early reflections are working on their own, you can mute dry, mute wet, the reverb, the late reverb, and just listen to your early. And you can also bypass the whole plugin. There is a certain amount of doubling up there, but it's really nice that you've got options to come at this from one of many different ways. You can also set your levels by typing them in. This is all really, really nice and well thought through. It gives you a lot of versatility, whether you're using this as an insert, which I encourage great caution on, or using it as a send. It allows you to have a lot more control over what you're hearing, which is just super. Really pleased with that. It does have a slightly different signal flow from the last one, and this is not too uncommon. It's not my favorite way, but the reverb works well enough in that you've got discrete or separate ways of hearing your early reflection and your late reverb. And your early reflection does not seem to feed your late reverb, which to me is odd, because in a room, if I do this, the first things that bounce back, the wall in front of me, the first bounce back, that's early reflection. But that's going to go straight past my head and bounce off the back wall and come back. And by the time it's done that a couple of times, that early reflection has fed the late signal, the reverby bit. So to have the two as separate is interesting, but this one, unlike the Dragonfly, doesn't seem to offer any kind of way of using the early to feed the late. But ultimately, it doesn't really seem to cause a problem. See it as being almost like using two reverb units. Here's this one which is focusing on the early, here's this one which is focusing on the late, and we'll put the pair of them together. Nothing wrong with that. I talked about sometimes using 2 or even 3 reverbs on the send to help build the room that I'm having that piece or song happen in. So nothing wrong with that. Just be aware that your earlies and your lates are actually separate from each other to a fair extent. Like the early is not feeding the late. Oddity, nothing particularly wrong with that. So let's work our way through the actual features of the object. We've got early and late, so pre-delay. This moves everything. In Dragonfly, the pre-delay only moved the late. In this, it moves both the early and the late, which is my preference. In an ideal world, you would have the ability to move the early and the ability to move the late either separately, or you move them both and then the ability to move the late a little bit further or offset it in some way. But there is nothing wrong with what we've got here, so we can have quite a noticeable gap. That's too noticeable as a general rule. That would only be used for an effect like a basketball court, but the fact that we can move that apart from the original signal means that we can get a sense of bigger space as well as clarity between the hit and its effect. I'm assuming this is in milliseconds. That's your pre-delay. Then width. Width here is good. It just goes from mono, full mono, out to normal stereo. It doesn't go out beyond 100% because despite what people seem to want to think with regards to stereo wideners, it is a thing that really should almost never be done, because it creates a weirdness. Now, while in electronically derived forms of music, you can do almost as much weirdness as you want, because there is no, that's what this thing sounds like. It's not like you're playing Chopin on a real piano that has a culturally defined sound. You can make whatever goofy sound you want. You can have your kick drum with its intensity up at 15,000 hertz if you want. It's probably not going to work for most people, but there's nothing to say you can't do it. So between 0 and 100% on width is the rational and sane thing. If for some bizarre reason you feel the need to go outside of that, then add your own phase or Haas plugins, but I would encourage you not to do that, because anytime you use any kind of stereo widener on anything bar perhaps an instrument, and that might be a sign that the instrument wasn't programmed right anyway, but anytime you do that, I'm not worried about phase collapsing. That's surprisingly rare these days, but it can happen. I'm just worried about the weirdness of mix that you get. Sometimes I pop on things. I popped on it was an acoustic guitar and a girl singing, and whoever she'd hired to engineer this had taken the two guitar lines, or there was one guitar line actually, sorry, they'd taken this one guitar line that she had played, they'd cloned it and phase inverted somehow and moved it out. So as soon as this thing comes on, I'm like, creepy weird. Don't do it. Just don't do it. So 0 to 100 is perfect. You can pick your width. You don't always want it to be 100. You pull that in a little bit, you can get a tighter kind of a sound. All depends on what your song is about, what's the scene that it's in. If it's in an expansive space, 100%. If you're looking to punch hard, then you might narrow that down a little bit so the reverb's here, and anything that you've got panned out a little bit will then really seem to come out of the sides. There's no right or wrong here. So that is our width, which applies equally to early and late. Variations. This is the bit of the plugin that I'm not as keen on, not because they're there. They're there is superb, because rather than it being like one reverb unit, we've got 12 early reflection models and 5 late models. So 12 and 5, 12 times 5 is a lot. A lot. So by combining these different things, we can get different sounds. We can hear that that's a different sounding reverb from what we had before. That's adding a nice kind of a movement, a groove into what's happening there. That's quite cool. If that's the right piece for that, that's quite cool. So you've got these variations. The reason I'm less than delighted with these is simply that there is no way of knowing what these might look or feel like. So they are just numbers. Yes, over time you might go, okay, I think that I get this kind of result with variation 2, and that kind of result with variation 11, but I feel like the manual, or even better, there would be nice if there was some way of seeing it up here. Obviously that's never going to happen, but getting a sense of what does this collection of delays look like. And it's probably going to be with regards to the timing and spacing and level shaping, volume shaping, enveloping of those delays over time. So which one of these is a bloom? Which one of these has delays that raise in level over time? So which one of them does that? I don't know. So the inability to see either on the plugin or in the manual unfortunately makes these more random than me being able to say that's the shape of outcome that I want. So they are just random numbers, which I think is sad. It's not going to kill the plugin in any way. Just with a modern design set, there's no reason that we couldn't have had some way of giving us an idea of what they are, or at least in the manual. You know, if they was in the manual, there were little graphics of them, especially if it was done in such a way that we could print it out and chuck darts in it so that it stays on our wall. That would be helpful and useful. We then got our time. How long is our delay? Our ultimate reverb going to be? This doesn't seem to affect earlies. Understandable, but it does affect lates. And clearly it will get quite long, and there's not too much what we might call ringing. So we're able to get big, thunderous, long reverbs with minimal artifacting. That's really, really nice, especially if, like me, you do space music and your reverbs tend to be longer than the average. So that's a good thing. So that just gives us our total time, which is going out to 20 seconds, which is long, far too long for the average pop rock type track. But the fact that you can do it is really, really good. We've then got our room size. Now this is merely moving the models of the early and late to say, do we push all of those delay taps together so that the total run of it's shorter, or do we move them further apart, which will give the illusion of being in a big, physically larger room. As in, if I clap, and let's say it takes 5 milliseconds for the sound to come back off that wall for me, the first one. That's the size of my room, we'll call that 1. If we double the size of our room, we've moved our knob to 2, then it's going to take 10 milliseconds for that bounce back to occur. And that's giving us the illusion of a larger room, because the larger the room, obviously, the more time it takes for our bounces to come back. The larger the room, the more likely to are to start to get that kind of rattly gunfire sort of result, especially on drums. So if we run right out into big, what's nice here is it does change the size of early reflections. So they do get a little tight and a little flangy when they're close, but that's to be expected because that's exactly what happens in a real room. And then when we get out into the lates, again, we've got no real dramas there, so it is quite smooth. It's I don't recall whether I've ever really had a situation where this sounds particularly sort of tappy or rattly. That will make people feel like it's a good reverb. I tend to like a tappy, rattly sort of reverb. Maybe it's just because that's what I grew up with in the 80s and 90s. Plus, as I've said, I tend to be very much an early reflections kind of a guy. So the size is quite simply giving a sense of how big is our room physically. You will tend to get a tighter, brighter sound with a short or small room size and a bigger, mushier sound with a large room size. We then have diffusion. Let's have a look at how his diffusion seems to be made. Doesn't seem to reflect early, not unusual. I'd say this is all pass, but it seems less characterful than the Dragonfly. I think there's probably a bigger range of movement that would be available, but he's decided, okay, that's the area that I like, kind of thing. Fair enough, he's the developer. Again, I would like the ability to have some sort of no diffusion so that you get quite a loose, rattly sort of set of reverbs coming back, but his decision is appropriate enough. As we go out to 100, we do notice that it just gets smoother, mushier, smushier, and that's okay. We've then got damping. So remember, as the sound moves around in the room, every time it bounces off something, then some of the signal tends to get absorbed. This really only has a high cut on that damping, and they're not showing a low cut. As such, not really much wrong with that. Again, I would rather see both a high cut damping and a low cut damping. But just seeing a high cut is common enough. So we can set a frequency at which that might occur, and then how much that will occur. So here, now that it's quite muted and muddy, otherwise very bright. So if you feel like your room is too, which it can be, then you can roll a bit off. It's tempting to say, I'm always going to leave it with no damping, but you can end up with some less than pleasing results as a result of that. So commonly enough, you're going to roll some off, at least, with the possible exception of where you're trying to do the really bright plate kind of thing, in which case you're looking for all that extra brightness to add sparkle to your commonly singer, but whatever you're wanting to put a bright plate on. Bright plate on a whole mix, yeah, no reason why you can't. Just listen, use your ears, decide, do I think this is making the mix brighter, solving my real problems, which is the mix lacks brightness, or do I feel like this is the right space in which I want people to feel like this is happening? If it's a bright, cheery song, yeah, you might want to use a bright plate on everything. But if it's sludgy doom, using a bright plate on things is probably not the right call. You're going to want to have a fair amount of damping, pretty low, so that you've got pretty reverby space, but you're pulling down with that sound over time. So your cutoff frequency and then how much that is closing down. So that's essentially how aggressive that filter is going to be. We then got modulation, which is just straight chorus. So there is an LFO, which is the rate. Now I like that this becomes very noticeably an LFO. It becomes noticeably a chorus. With Dragonfly I felt it was too mild. Not that it didn't work, it was just too mild to get interesting. So we can set the combination, just like a chorus, of how do we want this to be. Now, easy to overlook this and go, oh, well, why would we want that there? Because it's a reverb, not a chorus. But rooms do actually change their pitch. Yes, it's commonly put into an artificial reverb to stop them from ringing, so by moving things around, and it also moves that sound into the a little faster, because more frequencies, closer to noise. But rooms do actually come back at different pitches. If you end up with a large enough room, you can end up with an echo coming back flat. My father would tell a story, because he was a cathedral organist choirmaster, he would tell a story of a room that he worked in, or church that he worked in, I think it was in England, stone room, and the echo was noticeable, so you could hear it, so the choir were hearing their voices come back, and they came back flat. So what would happen is they'd hear it and slow down, because they were trying to match themselves to the echo. Put an echo in your cans and notice that that's what you do. You slow down to try to keep in time with that. And because it was coming back flat, they were going, oh no, I must be singing sharp. And so the choir that he would be working with would be hearing themselves and slowing down and singing flatter and flatter as the performance went through, and always having to try to get them to ignore that and lift. So rooms do have a pitching element. It's not ideal, hopefully in the Sydney Opera House or whatever, Carnegie Hall, that this doesn't happen, or it happens in a pleasing way. In a shower, we like the sound of a bathroom, because some of what comes back is actually out of tune. Now, this is the big missing mistake that the AutoTune Melodyne crowd have totally lost understanding of. See, there's a method for this. In that, if you've got a singer who's not perfectly in pitch all the time, congratulations, you've got a singer. Nobody should be perfectly in pitch all the time. But if they're a little, then part of the thing with echoes and reverbs is that you can chorus them a little bit. So let's say this was perfect tune, and we don't want perfect tune because it's boring and icky and actually very creepy, especially if done electronically. By adding chorusing to our echoes and our reverb, we're now moving the tuning. If our singer was actually, say, here, therefore a little flat, by adding this, see, we've now just hit the point here, which is where we said was in tune. So the listener will tend to normalize them to here far more than where they were. Yes, auto-tune them from there to there and think that you've solved the problem. No, you've just created a whole other problem. It's hard to mix that voice. It'll always sound weird. Doesn't matter whether you think, oh no, nobody can tell the difference. Anybody can tell the difference, because the thing that we are most keyed into in this universe as human beings is the voices of other human beings, and animals to some extent. So meddling with it is unwise. Whereas if we use a analog of a natural process, and digital tuning is not analog of a natural process, analog of a natural process being pitch variation coming back from the world around, chances are you can get that person within striking distance or overlapping where the official tune should be, and they will then taken to be far better in tune because it's natural variation. And any decent singer is actually constantly adjusting their tune to be part of the performance. So if you go flattening that so that they're singing like you've actually stopped them from being a good singer. You've stopped using whatever potential they have. So your modulation here fattens up your reverb, and is also going to help you pull things together. Did you notice that? If we've got our dry, flat, papery reverb pulled together, sense of space. So your modulation is a pretty important part of that. Don't overlook it. We then come to the EQ, and I do like the EQ on this. This is a global EQ, so it affects everything. So it's just at the end of all the reverb being created, we can just EQ it. And that's surprisingly nice, because the shape that you put on your tone here has a big impact on how people perceive the space. This is not great practice, but let's do this. We've got more of a live feel. I'm not saying you should do this, because I think that bass is problematic, but by overdoing it, you can hear how you get the whoomp whoomp, whoomp whoomp out of that kick drum, which gives you kind of that live feeling. We're adding a lot of brightness and sparkle into the mix, and we're doing it more naturally than going to the mix and just going whoop with our EQ, because it means our original sound is exactly as it was, assuming that's correct, and that our sound behind it is doing this. So you can use your reverb to color the original. Generally speaking, we might be looking more to do this sort of thing, which is to bring that into the mids. That lets the brightness of the original sound, and then it sort of becomes more centered and beefier. But anywhere in there is okay, as long as you're not creating a problem. You can even do reverbs like this. Find where you want it to. That has a very distinctive kind of a sound. What is it? Nasty, grimy, dirty warehouse? There are records that sound like they were deliberately mixed into what sound like a junkyard. Actually, the one I'm thinking of there is Ministry's Psalm 69. Sounds like it was kind of mixed into a junkyard full of rusting, abandoned bits of metal. And that's a really cool thing about that record. So you can make character reverbs and then push your piece into them, which is going to change the feeling of your piece. That's quite different from the smiley happy face bright reverb that we had just before. So don't overlook your EQ. Be cautious about overusing your EQ, but your EQ there is actually a really important part of shaping your reverb. I will again encourage, when you get to that point of going, okay, my mix is going to want some reverb, do that first. Do that before you start making all your mix decisions, because that way you've said, this is the scene in which this is playing. I'm going to put Juliet up there, I'm going to put Romeo down there, and I'm going to put this kind of environment around them. Whether that's Roma tomatoes because they're all Italians, or whether that's discarded machetes because they've... I won't go any further with that one. But nonetheless, you set the scene through the reverb, so you can be doing something like what I've done here and said, okay, this is the space I'm going to see them in. And then you mix into that space. Oh, I forgot to mention, when you turn your high boost cut right down low, then it just becomes a straight low pass filter. Experiment with different things. Automatically going to a low pass filter isn't always the best thing. Sometimes it's much nicer to use a low shelf. So there's still some of that stuff up there, but you've just de-emphasized it rather than de-allowing it to be there. So, cool. And the last thing is there are skins here. If you right-click up in this area here, actually any clicking in this area up here will allow you to change between skins. There's that dark skin you saw on KVR and skin 2 being the lighter skin, which I will recommend because it is significantly clearer. The dark skin may look sexier, but this is significantly clearer. And the whole job here is about you learning to understand reverb and how it works, not to be like, how cool am I because I've got a black Metallica t-shirt. Who cares? Because no one cares what you were looking at when you made this record, but they do care about how it feels. And if by having a GUI that you were more focused on how cool you feel and it decreased your ability to really see and feel and understand what was going on, you're the person in the wrong. So up to you, but I will strongly encourage skin 2, which is this lighter one, because it's so much clearer. You're far more likely to engage with what's really going on here than simply look at it and go, oh, isn't it cool? It's dark and colored. So there is our device. We'll run through the good and bads, which can be pretty quick because I've gone through them all already. That is, what's great is that we've got really good usability and really good feature sets. Yes, there are some extra little features that could be there, but it's not the end of the world that they're not there because how everything has been implemented is really good. Again, great kudos for the mixing. The ability to choose what you hear, when, where, how, why, including a global bypass, is very, very rare these days. And of course, it is 100% free. Yes, it's no longer being developed, that's a bad, but for the foreseeable future, it's probably going to still work for you if and when it gets to the point where the product no longer interfaces with the real world, then you'll be able to use what you've learned using this, not using presets, please, but by really understanding the knobs, you'll be able to carry that to any other decent quality device, which doesn't have to be something that starts with the word Pro. The other bad, or the thing that frustrates me, and I do find quite off-putting because it limits my ability to be able to use the device as clearly as it should be used, is no sense of what those variations are. I mean, what are they doing? What do they look like? What are they going to make the room sound or feel like? Not having that information, I think, is it's a big letdown. It doesn't mean you can't use the device, but it means it's much harder to use the device thoughtfully. Like you can't as easily say, okay, that's the shape of this room model, therefore that's the one I'm going to choose when I want to do this. You have to go through randomly, and I do not like working by randomness. It's not the work of a master to work randomly. You know, that's I pretend I know what I'm doing by randomly pressing buttons until I go, that doesn't suck anymore. That's not the way I was trained. So overall, really, really cool device with plenty going for it, but take your time. We'll now look at this in use in a mix. So I've gotten rid of the one across the masters, and now we've got our sends. I have, of course, taken this and taken it right out of the mix. We don't want to be hearing any dry because this is on a send. We've got signal coming back. It's there. We can hear it's there. That's all good. That's how it should be. You will see that I'm sending not from every single track, I'm sending from buses. So I went over this last time, but I'll always go over this. The drums and bass shouldn't be sent individually because they're going into a bus. Now in that bus we would probably be doing some processing. I don't know that I am, but if I was doing some EQ or some compression or something to change the sound of those drums and bass together, the rhythm section, then that is what has to go to the reverb, not this. Otherwise, let's say I've made it really dark and boomy at the bus level, but here on the track level, they're still bright and non-boomy and thin and what have you. Your reverb will now sound thin rather than being representing the dark and boomy sound that you have made. So always, bus gets the reverb send, not the tracks. I encourage you to work with buses as soon as you can because there are a lot of really good things. So same with guitars, they're coming from the bus, and the synth isn't going to a bus, so it comes just straight from the synth. They're set to -12 dB, which is a good, safe send level. If we decide that we want more or less of something, let's say, just put this in, solo. Let's say I decided that was a bit too much. Then I might drop 3 or 6 dB off that. So it gives a little bit more clarity because your drums, especially if you've got plenty of reverb, your drums can start to, in which case you keep it in there. Don't go going, oh, I'll do that, because then your drums will be completely outside or in a separate room, but you can pull maybe 3 or 6 dB back and still keep them with the feeling of being together. We set up our times for what we want our reverb to sound like. If you have the facility, it can be nice just to listen to the return. Let's say I only want my early reflections to be heard at the moment. That's probably going to be nice. Let's pop that back in. Forgot my late. So there's a brightness that I've added here, but then I'm also stopping it from washing too far. I've got quite a long decay time, but I'll leave that there. Damping, all of that's good. Modulation. I was expected to be rate depth first, but they've got backwards, whatever. I'll say for a moment that that's okay. How good it is, don't know, in cans, not really relevant. But just that sense that you can create your reverb in a solo so that you get a sense of what's this room sound like, put it together. Okay, that's my whole room. I'm going to say I'm happy enough with that because you don't need to sit here for 2 hours watching me do that. We will call that okay. And then we look at making sure that we've got this coming into the mix. That's good. Our sends are probably all okay. but this is not enough. I'm happy with my reverb, which is this one down here. This one's no longer in the game. But it's still quite flat. We don't have a lot of depth in that room. Yes, as when the reverb comes in, we get a little bit of space, but we don't have any specific space. And you would have seen this last time, but notice the difference here. Switching those guitars in, suddenly we've got more space around them. Now our synth has become really big and very lyrical, beautiful. So it's really important to be using echoes, delays in your mix that are going to feed the reverb. I see a lot of people using their echoes on sends and returns, and the problem with them is that they don't become part of the room. They don't become part of the mix. And that makes no sense. Yes, in the old days where you had one delay line that you had to use for everything, putting it on a send makes sense. But then you would be bringing that back in on a track and sending that to your reverb. So you might bring it back in on another track here or another channel and then assign it to your reverb. But these days that is not necessary unless you've got like a Pentium 2 or something really embarrassing as a computer. You don't want to be doing that because you're shooting yourself in the foot. So reverbs on sends for your one room, not something that looks like this. One reverb on a send for this, one reverb on a send for that, one reverb on a send for this one. That's just stupid because you've got no single room. So you set up your one reverb, this is a room the whole piece happens in, and then delays, you put them in what we might call the insert position, so that this sound here is what's fed to the reverb up there. So again, we've got our reverbs on a delay in. Notice how our mix becomes richer, and it's that lack of care with the combination of the reverb space for the whole room being actually made deliberately rather than just, oh, I'll throw in that preset because I don't know, and then the echoes to position the other parts of the mix, your drums, your guitars. Generally you don't put echoes on basses, but there are times you do. Definitely synths, vocals, all of those things. You put different echoes, different times, different levels, and that way you end up with this really thick, deep mix that when it hits the reverb becomes even richer. So that's the real secret, which was never a secret. It's the real key to getting your reverb space to absolutely shine. That it's not one thing, it's a combination of several things. There we go. So final words is that it is a free device that's discontinued, but if you are looking for a reverb, there is very little to be unhappy about with this, bar just the caveats that it doesn't have a future, but it's going to be a long time before that's probably a problem, and these variations not being explained. Given time, you will probably get used to them, but otherwise, for a free device, you get a really nice sound. There are some things it won't do, like it won't do the sort of rattly, loose, echoey kind of things, but you can do that surprisingly easily with any halfway decent delay line that's not locked to the BPM, or a combination. Put 3 or 4 delay lines into a box. A combinator if you're in Reason. I can't remember what they're called if you're in Bitwig or Ableton, but they pretty well everywhere has this little box that you can throw several things in and treat them as one unit with macros. So throw several delay lines in there, and then you can get that loose, rattly early reflection or sparse reverb, and then combine it with this. So if I were looking for something with a sparser reverb, then I might well create myself a combinator which has got that really sparse reverb, and then this as well, or simply have two sends. So everything would look like this. One's going to the rattle box, the other's going to the other thing. Yes, they're paralleling and not really feeding each other, but together they will create a really big, warm, organic sound that nobody's going to go, oh, I've heard that preset before, because you've made it. So lots of different ways to do it. Super device, a lot of control. You will need to take your time. Again, advice is to use the Skin 2, which gives you a much clearer view, so you're more likely to be able to focus on what you need to do rather than focusing on how cool it feels to have a black device with colored knobs. Take your time. Learn how to really control every aspect of this. That means practice. If you're not prepared to practice your craft, you won't grow. You won't get any better. Going, oh, well, I'll just do it when I do it, and therefore sooner or later I'll get better. Yeah, it's not the way it goes. Specifically, sit down with different types of material, with drums, with bass, drum and bass together, with vocals if you can. I mean, setting up a reverb with vocals it's the nicest thing ever. And various separate parts of it mix going, this is what happens when I put this kind of reverb in, when I use these kinds of settings, this is what it sounds like. And that way you're building a big spreadsheet of things. But great device, far more to recommend it than to limit it. Just take your time, stay away from presets. It's not because the presets are bad, it's just because they are not related to what you are trying to do. They are not your piece. They're not your piece until you really consciously come in here and go, I want more of this, I want less of that, this is the space I'm creating. When you're saying, like whoever mixed Ministry's Psalm 69, who has really consciously thought, I want this whole record to sound like it's happening in a junkyard of rusting, abandoned metal machines. That's the right thinking for a mix engineer, and that doesn't come out of presets. Even if there is a junkyard preset, it's not going to equal the thinking, the feeling that went behind Psalm 69. So in conclusion, super device, well worth using, and a really great device for learning reverb. If you have any questions about this, not how to troubleshoot the device, please, that's not my job, but about reverb and mixing and making things happen, then please hit subscribe first, explain your situation below. Once I become aware of it, I will give you an answer. The answer will be given to everyone, so while it may relate to your specific situation, it will also be for everyone to read and understand. This is how we all get bigger and better people. But the most important thing is have a good day.